Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Sorry that I've been a little bit quiet recently. Some of you may know that my wife and I just had a new baby, so things have been quite busy here. This video is going to be going over how I've been painting my Boarding Actions terrain set, but everything in this video could easily be used for painting any 40k or sci-fi terrain. After cleaning up all of the parts and removing all the mould lines and gluing everything together, I then primed it all black, making sure to get all of the bits behind the doors and giving everything a good solid coat. I then used some lead belcher through the airbrush to start adding the first colour. I gave all of the parts a good coat of this from above and from a slight angle, so that it would be darker in the recesses. If you want to speed this process up though, I'd recommend using a spray can as there's quite a lot to get through. Once it was all done and dry, it was looking like this. The darker recessed parts helping to give it some definition. I then wanted to break up the colour a little bit and add some visual interest, so I used some brighter silver. This was iron breaker through the airbrush in some random patches all over the walls. I wasn't using this as a highlight, more just a way to break up the wall's flat colour and to brighten some of the areas. This step would really help later on with the final look once all the washes were on, as everything would get a lot darker. This is how everything was looking once all the metallics were done. Next I wanted to add some colour to the metal and make it more interesting to look at. You could easily skip this step, but I really do love the effect it has and it's definitely worth taking the time to do. I started with Agaros Dunes contrast paint and started to spray in random small patches on each of the walls and columns, making sure to get a little bit on each section. As it's a contrast paint, it's very transparent and shows the shine of the metallic paint through it. I then repeated the same process using Druki Violet, which is a shade paint, this time overlapping the areas of the Agaros dunes and trying to blend them both together. This is such a good look for metal that's been heated and cooled. It works really well if you're painting melter guns or flamers. I then did the same thing using Drakenhof Nightshade, which is a blue shade paint, this time overlapping the purple areas. I was a little more sparing though with this one because it's quite a strong colour and I didn't want everything to look too blue. Adding the patches of Ironbreaker to the metallics earlier really helps this effect too. All of the colours start to look slightly different due to the difference between the light and the dark areas of the metal. The next colour I added was some Blood Angels Red contrast paint, again quite sparingly. I didn't add this to every panel, maybe 1 in 3, just enough to add a little bit of extra colour to each one. Lastly, I picked a handful of the walls and added some Orc Flesh contrast paint to the very bottoms of them. This works well to give the impression of algae or moss growing in damp areas. Again, I was very sparing with this. I didn't want everything to look too green and to overpower everything. This is the result when all of these colours were added. It's a little bit bright, but all of this is going to get knocked back a bit later. Next I started to add some colour to the details. I used Agaros Dunes again to paint in all of these plaques and the Mechanicus symbols. As it's a contrast paint, this goes on nice and quick and does all the shading and the highlight in one go. With all of the next steps and picking out all of the details, you can do as much or as little as you want. I just picked out a few prominent bits on each wall and then moved on to the next one. Once it's on a tabletop and about 3 feet away, you won't see all of these details, but the added colour here and there will make it look so much better. I then did the same with the Blood Angels Red contrast paint on all of the pipes and a few other little bits and pieces here and there, like vents and electrical boxes. Again, just do as much or as little as you have the patience for. I also used this red to paint in some of the doors. Not all of them, just a few to add some bigger areas of colour and to make the doors more prominent. I did a few more of the doors using Nazdrag Yellow, leaving maybe 1 in 3 of the doors unpainted. Pterodon Turquoise was then used for some of the screens and Plaguebearer Flesh on some of the others, just keeping it random and not too uniform across the duplicate walls. I also used a little bit of Creed camo to fill in some of these round screens that are on the control panels dotted around the set. Black Legion contrast paint was then used to paint in some of the wires and all of the bigger thick cables. The next step was the remaining cables. I used some bright colours for these to make them stand out and to help compensate for the colours being knocked back later on when I added the washes. I used Phalanx Yellow, Evil Sun Scarlet and Calgar Blue and painted in all of the wires, trying to get a good mix of each colour on each wall. Again, don't feel you need to paint in every single wire, it's quite time consuming. Just do as much as you feel you want to. I used the same colours I painted the wires in to add some dots of colour to the buttons on the control panels. I wasn't super neat with this, any imperfections will get covered up later. I dotted in all of the mechanical eyes on the servo skulls using Evil Sun Scarlet, and then painted in every single skull using Karak Stone. This being 40k terrain, there are a lot of skulls, they are everywhere. I definitely started to regret the decision to paint all of them in, but it was worth it in the end. Each one needed 2 coats to hide the metal underneath, and it did take some time. The next step was to add a little extra detail. I went through my decal collection and added a few numbers to the doors and the odd Imperial Aquila to some of the walls. Not necessary, but it does add some nice extra detail. And this is how it looked all together. I really like the look, and you could easily leave it at this stage and have a really good looking table, but there's a couple more steps to really finish it off. I used some dark brown enamel wash. This is just what I happen to have in my collection, but any brown wash will do. I then started to cover every piece of the set in a thin layer of this wash, doing it in batches of 4 or 5 walls at a time. I left them for about 10 to 15 minutes to dry slightly before using some white spirit soaked in a cloth and started to clean off the wash from the raised areas. I also used an old brush to do the same thing to clean some of the wash off, and also used some kitchen towel to then dab off the excess, leaving some stippling marks behind. How much of the brown wash you remove is entirely up to you, just keep at it until it looks how you want it. I'd suggest doing one piece first, leaving it to dry as a test before doing any more so that you're happy with the final effect. This is quite a long process, but worth it when it's complete. It'll make everything look old and disused, and really help to sell the setting. I left this outside to dry for an afternoon, and this is how it looked. Pretty dirty and grungy looking, but all those bright colours added to the metal at the beginning showing through and making it look more interesting. One last step. I wanted to add some lighting effects to some of the lamps and the electrical equipment on the walls. I first sprayed some white ink onto the lights, making sure to get the surrounding areas as well, but keeping it brighter and more focused to the centre. I didn't do all of the lights, just a few. I think if they were all done it would be a bit too much and spoil the rundown look. When this was dry, I went over the white with Athematic Blue contrast paint. I made sure to cover the areas surrounding the white too, not being super neat, but to get the colour to fade out away from the light source. I did the same thing using Iyanden yellow contrast paint on some of the lights too, to add some variety. As a very last step, I added some rust pigments to the bottom of each piece just to finish them off. And this is the finished result. This is about a third of the whole set. I'm painting it in smaller batches, but I'll definitely have some pictures up of the whole thing when it's completed on Instagram at some point. I'm also considering making a custom board for it to all go on, rather than using the cardboard that comes as part of the set. Let me know if that's something you'd be interested in seeing. Thanks so much for sticking with me while I've been a bit quiet. I'm going to try and get some more videos up a bit more regularly when I can. I hope that this has been useful and will be helpful for your terrain projects. I'm sure lots of you have this boarding action set at home and it's been sat in the box waiting for paint, so maybe this will get a few more of them done and ready for games. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all soon.